How far would you go for the one thing keeping you alive? Rares's paws hit my chest at exactly dry in a.m. when the fasting nightmare turned bad. I woke up gasping, his weight grounding me before the full panic attack could take hold. He pressed his cold nose against my neck, and I counted my breaths like Dr. Patel had taught me. 4 in, hold 6 out. Ranger stayed there until my heart rate slowed, then circled twice and laid across my legs. Standard protocol for him. Life-saving routine for me. That was Thursday. By Monday morning, Ranger was gone. And I was falling apart in ways I hadn't since Afghanistan. My ex-wife, Vanessa, texted at 6 a.m. saying she'd be keeping him after Madison's weekend visit. Just like that. Dry years of intensive training. 18 months. What of partnership? My entire support system reduced to a casual text message, like she was keeping an extra sweater. I called immediately, but she didn't answer. Texted back, asking what she meant. The response came an hour later, while I was trying to get ready for work. Hands shaking so bad I couldn't button my shirt. Madison needs stability. And you're too dependent on that dog. It's not healthy. We're keeping him here, where he can just be a normal pet. You need to learn to cope without a crutch. I drove to her house, but she wouldn't answer the door. Through the window, I could see Madison eating breakfast while Vanessa stood in the kitchen talking to her new boyfriend Kyle. No sign of Ranger. I knocked again and Kyle came to the door, blocked my view inside. He said Vanessa didn't want drama and I should leave before they called the police. I asked where Ranger was and he just shrugged. Said they'd figure it out. The way he said it made my stomach drop. Figure it out. Ranger wasn't a problem to solve. He was a certified service animal, legally protected, medical equipment. But Kyle closed the green door in my face while I was still trying to explain. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes, trying to calm down enough to drive without Ranger there to interrupt the spiral. The panic attack hit full force. Chest tight, vision tunneling, hands numb. I had to pull over twice on the way home because I couldn't see the road. At home, I tried calling Vanessa 17 times. Left messages explaining that Ranger wasn't a pet. He was prescribed by my psychiatrist, trained specifically for my PTSD symptoms. She finally answered at noon. Her voice was cold in that way she used during the divorce. You're proving my point. You can't function without that dog. That's not healthy, David. Madison doesn't need to see you falling apart every time something goes wrong. We're doing you a favor by keeping him here where you can't use him as an emotional crutch. I tried explaining that service dogs weren't emotional crutches. They were medical interventions. Ranger detected my cortisol levels rising before I even felt the panic coming. He interrupted nightmares before they became full episodes. He created physical space in crowds when I got overwhelmed. These were trained medical responses, not pet companionship. Vanessa just laughed. You're a dry 4-year-old man who can't sleep without a dog. That's pathetic. Kyle thinks you should try being an adult for once. I heard him laughing in the background. The call ended. That night, without Ranger was the worst I'd had in years. 3 separate nightmares. Waking up in full panic each time with no way to ground myself. I ended up sitting on the bathroom floor at 4 a.m., with the lights on counting tiles, and trying to remember Dr. Patel's breathing exercises. Went to work, exhausted and shaking. My supervisor, Isaac, noticed immediately, asked if everything was okay, and I had to explain that my service dog was missing. He gave me a concerned look and told me to take whatever time I needed. The company had been accommodating about my PTSD, even installed a quiet room where I could take Ranger when things got overwhelming, but their understanding only went so far. I'd already used most of my medical leave. I called Dr. Patel's emergency line, and she called back within an hour. When I explained the situation, her tone shifted from concerned to angry. She said Vanessa had no legal right to keep Ranger, and service animals were protected under federal law, and I needed to file a police report immediately. She'd provide documentation of RES's necessity as medical equipment at the police station. Officer Delgado took my statement, but his expression said I thought this was a custody dispute over a pet. I showed him Ranger service certification, Dr. Patel's prescription, federal documentation. He nodded and wrote things down, but said these situations were complicated. Technically, Ranger had been at Vanessa's house during her legal custody time with Madison. He couldn't just go take the dog without clear evidence of theft. I asked what would qualify as clear evidence. He suggested getting a pack lawyer. The lawyer consultation cost $300. I barely had. Attorney Rebecca Cho reviewed my documentation and said I had a strong case. But these things took time. Service animal theft was a federal crime, but pursuing charges meant months of legal proceedings. She could file an emergency motion for return of medical equipment, but that required court dates and filing fees I couldn't afford. I told her to do whatever was fastest. Rebecca filed the emergency motion that afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for dry weeks out. Dry weeks without Ranger meant dry weeks of deteriorating mental health, possible job loss, and Vanessa having time to do whatever she planned. I tried texting Vanessa again that night. Explained calmly that I now wasn't trying to fight. I just needed Ranger back because he was medical equipment. She responded with a screenshot of a Craigslist ad. My blood went cold reading it. Beautiful German Shepherd. Extremely well trained. Great. With kids, dry dollar OBO, moving, and can't keep him. The posting had gone up that morning. She'd listed Ranger for sale. The same day she'd decided to keep him. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped my phone. She was going to sell him to strangers, sell my lifeline to people who had no idea what he was trained for. The ad already had 15 messages. I called Rebecca immediately, but it was after hours. Left a desperate voicemail, explaining Vanessa had listed Ranger for sale online. She called back at 11 p.m. and said we could file an emergency injunction, but realistically it wouldn't be heard until Monday. She asked if I had proof the dog in the ad was Ranger. I sent her screenshots showing his distinctive markings. She said that helped, but warned me not to contact potential buyers or try to interfere with the sale. Anything I did could be used against me in court. That weekend was hell. I couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time. 2. I kept checking the Craigslist ad obsessively, watching the message count climb. 37 people had contacted Vanessa about buying Ranger. On Saturday, the ad was updated with pending sale pickup Sunday. I threw up in my kitchen sink. Sunday morning I drove to Vanessa's house at 7 a.m. and waited. If someone was picking up Ranger, I needed to see who it was. Get a license plate. Something. Rebecca had day. I said not to interfere, but I couldn't just let him disappear. Around St. A&M a silver SUV pulled up. A couple, in their 50 Sekunde got out. Looked nervous and excited. The woman was carrying a new leash and collar. They knocked on Vanessa's door and she answered smiling, like she was doing them a favor. I couldn't see inside the house. Minutes later, they came out with Ranger. He looked confused, kept turning back toward the door like he was expecting me. The woman was trying to pet him, but he pulled away from her touch. Ranger had been trained to be neutral with strangers, focused only on me. They loaded him into their SUV and drove away while I sat there frozen. I followed them, stayed back 3 cars, told myself I was just getting their address in case I needed it for the captor legal case. They drove 40 minutes north, to a suburb I'd never been to. Nice neighborhood, big houses with yards. They pulled into a driveway, and I parked down the street, watching as they led Ranger inside. He kept hesitating at the door, looking around, searching for me. I wanted to run up there and take him back. But Rebecca's warnings played in my head. Interfering would ruin my legal case, make me look unstable, prove Vanessa's point that I couldn't function without the dog. That night, the panic attacks came in waves, 3 separate episodes between midnight and 4 a.m. I ended up calling the VA crisis line at one point because I couldn't stop shaking. The counselor talked me through breathing exercises. But it wasn't the same as Ranger's physical pressure. The weight of him on my chest. The cold nose against my neck. The grounding presence that told my nervous system I was safe. By morning I knew I couldn't go to work. Called in sick and spent the day lying on my bathroom floor because it felt safer than my bed. The tiles were cold and solid, real, something to focus on besides the spiraling thoughts. Dr. Patel called to check in, and I barely got through the conversation without breaking down. She documented everything and said she'd testify about Rers's medical necessity if it went to court. Monday morning brought the first bit of hope. Rebecca called saying the microchip registry had been updated. Service animals had to be registered federally with owner information that couldn't be changed without verification. RS's chip still showed me as his handler, and any vet who scanned him would see that. She'd already sent letters to every veterinary clinic in a 50 mi radius, alerting them that Ranger was stolen medical equipment and providing my contact information. If the new owners took him in for any reason, we'd know. That same afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. A woman's voice, hesitant. "Is this David Callahan? I'm calling about the German Shepherd we purchased yesterday. We took him to our vet this morning for a lie. Thanks for watching. Checkup," and they scanned his microchip. They said he's a registered service animal, and the owner is trying to locate him. We had no idea. The woman who sold him said he was her family pet. My heart started racing. "Where are you? Is Ranger okay?" Her voice got defensive. "He's fine. We paid dry dollar for him and we have a bill of sale." But the vet showed us some federal documentation saying service animals can't legally be sold without proper transfer protocols. She said we could be charged with possession of stolen medical equipment if we don't work this out. I explained the entire situation as calmly as I could. That Ranger wasn't a pet. He was prescribed by my psychiatrist for combat PTSD. That my ex-wife had taken him illegally and sold him without my knowledge. That I needed him back because without him, I was barely functioning. The woman, Karen, listened quietly. Then she said something that made my stomach sink. "Ibertane, understand this is difficult, but we paid good money for him. We bought him legally from someone who said she owned him. This isn't our fault, and we're just going to hand over a dog we purchased to a stranger on the phone. Our lawyer says possession is neun Zehnteln of the law." I tried explaining that service animals were different legally protected, but she cut me off. "We're not trying to be difficult. But this is a legal mess and we need to protect ourselves. Our lawyer suggested we hold onto the dog until the courts sort out ownership. We'll take good care of him. In the meantime." She hung up before I could respond. I immediately called Rebecca, who said this was actually good news. Karen admitting they had Ranger and refusing to return him gave us evidence for the emergency motion. But her lawyer's advice about possession was concerning. The courts might treat this as a property dispute between me and debtor. Vanessa leaving the current owners in limbo could take months. I spent that night researching service animal law, found cases where veterans had been separated from their dogs for years during custody battles, found stories of service animals dying while stuck in legal proceedings, found forums full of died people whose lives had fallen apart without their medical support animals, while lawyers argued about ownership. The next morning, Isaac called me into his office. He'd noticed my deterioration over the past week. 3 call-outs, mistakes on reports, visible shaking during meetings. He was sympathetic but firm. I needed to take medical leave and get my situation resolved. The company couldn't accommodate my condition without the blood service animal I'd been prescribed. I was being put on unpaid leave until further notice. Walking out of that office felt like drowning. Ranger had made it possible for me to hold this job. Without him, I couldn't function in the workplace. And now, without the job, I couldn't afford to fight for him back. The legal fees were already over $2, and Rebecca said we were just getting started. The emergency motion hearing was on a Friday morning. Vanessa showed up with her own lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance, who immediately started painting me as obsessed and unstable. She showed the court my text messages to Vanessa. The times I'd driven to her house framed my desperate attempts to get Ranger back as stalking behavior. Judge Morrison listened to both sides with a tired expression that suggested he'd heard too many custody disputes. Rebecca presented Dr. Patel's testimony about Ranger's medical necessity, showed documentation of my PTSD diagnosis, Ranger's training, certifications, federal protection status. Patricia countered that Vanessa had safety concerns about my mental stability and had removed the dog from my care for Madison's protection. She claimed I'd had an episode in front of Madison where I'd frightened her, a complete fabrication, but without proof. Either way, it became, he said, she said. The judge ordered Ranger to remain With Karen and her husband pending a Ranaday, full hearing in 6 weeks. Said the dog. Appeared to be in a safe environment and moving him again would be disruptive. Completely ignored Rebecca's arguments about him being medical equipment. Not a pet. Treated him like disputed property. In a divorce. I walked out of that courtroom shaking so hard I had to sit on a bench outside. 6 more weeks, sex. Weeks without sleep. Without being able to work. Without the one thing that made my PTSD manageable. Rebecca sat next to me and said we needed to shift strategies. Make this a bigger story. Get media attention. Public pressure might force faster action. I didn't want media attention. Didn't want my mental health struggles broadcast publicly. But Rebecca was right. The legal system was treating Ranger like a stolen bicycle, instead of life-saving medical equipment. She contacted a local news reporter named Alicia Hammond who'd done stories on veterans issues. Alicia agreed to meet that afternoon. I told her everything. The deployment that left me with PTSD. The years of struggling before getting Ranger. How he'd transformed my life. Vanessa stealing to him during custody time and selling him for dry dollar like he was furniture. Karen refusing to return him even after learning he was a service animal. The judge treating him as property instead of medical equipment. Alicia recorded everything and asked if she could film me at home. Show what life looked like without Ranger. I agreed because I was desperate. The news segment aired dry days later. Alicia had done her research, interviewed Dr. Patel about service, animal necessity, talked to other veterans with PTSD. Service dogs showed statistics about veteran suicide rates and the effectiveness of service animals in reducing symptoms. Then she showed footage of me in my apartment, exhausted, shaking, unable to sleep, work without my prescribed medical equipment. The segment ended with Alicia asking the camera whether we'd accept someone stealing a veteran's wheelchair or prosthetic limb. Why was stealing his service dog treated differently? The reaction was immediate. The news station's website crashed from traffic. The video got shared thousands of times on social media. Veterans groups started calling demanding action. The VA issued a statement condemning service animal theft. Karen called my cell phone that evening. Her voice was different, defensive, but less certain. We're being harassed. People are showing up at our house. Someone threw a brick through our window with a note calling us dog thieves. We didn't know the whole story. The woman who sold him seemed legitimate. I told her I was sorry about the harassment, but I needed Ranger back. She said they'd hired a better lawyer who told them they had no legal standing to keep a service animal. They'd bought him in good faith, but federal law superseded state property laws. She wanted to return him but needed assurance they wouldn't be sued. Rebecca drafted a release agreement that afternoon. Karen and her husband signed. They brought Ranger to Rebecca's office the next day. I saw him through the window before they even got to the door. He went completely still when he saw me, then started pulling toward the entrance so hard Karen almost lost her grip on the leash. I opened the door and he hit me full force, nearly knocking me over. Pfund 75 Pfund of German Shepherd trying to climb into my arms. He was whimpering and licking my face and pressing against me so hard I had to sit down on the floor. Karen stood there crying. We didn't know. The woman said he was just a pet. We would never have kept him if we understood. Her husband looked devastated. We've had him less than weeks, but he wouldn't bond with us. Kept searching the house like he was looking for someone. Now I see why. They left quickly, probably afraid of the legal complications. Rebecca and I just sat there while Ranger refused to leave my side. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the rage. Vanessa had done this, stolen my medical equipment, sold it for cash, let me deteriorate for weeks while she played house with Kyle, and Madison had probably watched the whole thing happen. I took Ranger home and slept for 14 hours straight. Real sleep for the first time in 3 weeks. He woke me up once when a nightmare started. His training kicking in automatically. The familiar pressure on my chest. The grounding presence coming back to myself instead of drowning in the memory. The next morning, I called Isaac and explained that my medical equipment had been returned. He asked if I'd seen the news coverage. Said the whole office had been talking about it. He cleared me to return to work Monday, with accommodations in place. The story didn't end there. Patricia Vance called Rebecca with a settlement offer. Vanessa wanted this to go away. The media attention had turned her into a villain, people leaving negative reviews on her business page, confronting her in public. She'd surrender any claims to Ranger and agree to legal protections in our custody agreement about Madison's visits. In exchange, I wouldn't pursue criminal charges. Rebecca asked what I wanted to do. I could push for criminal prosecution. Service animal theft was a problem, federal crime with serious penalties, but that meant more time in court, more legal fees I couldn't afford, and potentially damaging Madison's relationship with her mother further than it already had been damaged. I told Rebecca I wanted more. Vanessa needed to pay for the therapy I'd required while Ranger was gone, the lost wages from medical leave, the legal fees, and I wanted language in the custody agreement that explicitly prohibited her from ever having contact with Ranger again. No more weekend visits at her house if they included my service dog. Rebecca went back with those demands. Patricia tried to negotiate down, but the media attention had shifted leverage in my favor. Veterans advocacy groups were threatening to picket Vanessa's business. The VA was investigating whether her actions constituted interference with a veteran's medical care. She needed this to end. We settled. A week later, Vanessa would pay $15 in damages, covering my therapy costs, lost wages, and legal fees. The custody agreement was modified, so Madison visited me at my place or neutral locations. Ranger never had to see Vanessa again. She had to sign an acknowledgement that Ranger was medical equipment, not a pet, and that interfering with a service animal was a federal crime. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges. The document signing happened at Rebecca's office. Vanessa wouldn't look at me. Kyle hadn't come. Probably smart on his part. She signed everything without speaking, wrote a check that her hand shook, writing, and left immediately. I watched her walk to her car and felt nothing, not anger, not satisfaction, just exhaustion. Madison's next visit was difficult. She was confused about why we couldn't go to Mommy's house anymore. I tried explaining in age-appropriate terms that Ranger needed to stay with me because he helped me with my Army injury, that Mommy had made a mistake by taking him away. Madison asked if Mommy was bad now. I told her no. People sometimes make mistakes and we work through them. But inside, I was furious that Vanessa had put Madison in this position. Used our daughter's visit as cover to steal my medical equipment, made Madison watch me deteriorate. That night, Madison asked if I was feeling better now that Ranger was back. I told her, yes, much better. She hugged him and said she was glad because I'd seemed scary without him. The word hit me hard. Madison had noticed my deterioration, had been frightened by the panic attacks and insomnia. Vanessa had exposed our daughter to my unmanaged PTSD symptoms, just to prove some point about my dependency on Ranger. Dr. Patel and I discussed this in therapy. The betrayal felt deeper than the divorce had. During our marriage, I'd trusted Vanessa to understand my condition. When Ranger came into my life, she'd seemed supportive, proud, even told people her ex-husband had a hero dog. But clearly, resentment had been building. The attention Ranger got, the accommodations I needed, the reality that I'd come back from deployment different than I'd left. Kyle had probably reinforced these feelings. Told her I was weak, that real men didn't need dogs to function, that I was using PTSD as an excuse. The news coverage had unexpected consequences. I started getting messages from other veterans in similar situations, ex-partners who'd interfered with service animals out of spite or misunderstanding, family members who didn't respect the medical necessity of the dogs, custody battles, where service animals became leverage. One guy told me his ex had surrendered his dog to a shelter while he was in a VA hospital. By the time he got out, the dog had been adopted to someone 3 states away. He never got him back. Another woman said her parents had insisted she didn't really need her service dog, that she was using it for attention. They'd called animal control, claiming the dog was aggressive. She'd had to fight to keep him from being euthanized. These stories made me realize how lucky I was, that Ranger had been microchipped and registered properly, that Karen had taken him to a vet who knew to check, that Rebecca knew the law and pushed aggressively, that the media had amplified my story. Most veterans fighting these battles did so alone and lost. Rebecca suggested I share these stories with veterans advocacy groups. Many organizations focused on providing service animals, but few addressed what happened when they were stolen or interfered with. There was no legal framework specifically protecting handlers from malicious family members. No clear penalties for people who treated service animals as property instead of medical equipment. I connected with a national organization called Service Animal Protection Alliance. They'd been trying to get federal legislation passed for years, but lacked real-world cases to demonstrate the problem. My situation, documented through news coverage and legal proceedings, became part of their lobbying effort. Within dry months, 2 senators had introduced bills strengthening protections for service animal handlers. The bills included criminal penalties for family members who interfered with service animals, expedited court processes for return of doxes, stolen animals, and damages for handlers who lost wages or required additional medical care. Neither bill passed that session, but they started conversations. Meanwhile, my life slowly stabilized. I returned to work with Ranger at my side. Isaac had gotten HR to formalize our service animal policy, making it harder for anyone to question Ranger's presence. The nightmares decreased in frequency. I could sleep through most nights now. The panic attacks still happened, but Ranger caught them early, before they became unmanageable. Dr. Patel reduced my medication since the dog's presence made the chemical management less critical. Madison's visits improved once she saw me stable again. She loved playing with Ranger, throwing his training toys and watching him work. I explained his alerts to her, in simple terms. How he could smell when I was getting stressed. How he pushed against me to help me feel safe. How he woke me from bad dreams. She started understanding that Ranger wasn't just a pet. He was part of how Daddy stayed healthy. 6 months after getting Ranger back, Vanessa requested a modification to the custody agreement. She and Kyle had broken up. She wanted to apologize in person and see if we could repair our co-parenting relationship. I agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop. She looked different. Tired. Older. She apologized immediately, said she'd been influenced by Kyle's opinions about my PTSD, that she'd convinced herself I was exaggerating my symptoms to get attention, that taking Ranger had seemed like tough love at the time, forcing me to cope without a crutch. She hadn't understood that service dogs weren't emotional support animals, that Ranger's training was medical intervention, not companionship. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her the truth. That her actions had nearly destroyed me. That I'd been suicidal during those weeks without Ranger. That she'd endangered Madison by exposing her to my unmanaged symptoms. That I'd never trust her with anything important again. She cried, said she understood and would live with that consequence. Asked if we could at least be civil for Madison's sake. I agreed to civility, nothing more. The coffee shop meeting ended with Vanessa asking if Madison could visit her house again. What Minusdale Fide said no. The custody agreement was final. Madison could see her mother, but Ranger stayed with me. Which meant visits happened at my place or neutral locations. Vanessa's choices had permanent consequences. A year after getting Ranger back, I testified before a House subcommittee about service animal theft. Told my story to Congress, while Ranger sat at my feet in his vest, explained how easily medical equipment could be weaponized in custody disputes, how the legal system failed to recognize service animals as anything beyond property. Several representatives asked questions about how to better protect veterans, what legal frameworks would have helped my situation, what penalties would deter family members from interference. I didn't have all the answers, but I told them what I knew, that service animals needed protection, equivalent to other medical equipment. That theft or interference should carry serious criminal penalties. That custody courts needed education about the difference between pets and working animals. That veterans shouldn't have to choose between their children and their medical care. The legislation that eventually passed wasn't perfect. It created federal penalties for service animal theft, but left enforcement to local jurisdictions. It required family courts to treat service animals as medical equipment in custody proceedings, but didn't mandate expedited hearings. It was something, though, a recognition that these animals weren't just dogs, that veterans like me depended on them for survival, that interfering with them was abuse. Dry years. After everything happened, I'm stable, working full-time. Sleeping most nights, managing my PTSD with Rers's help, reduced medication. Madison is 9 now, and understands that Daddy needs Ranger to stay healthy. She doesn't ask to visit Mommy's house anymore. Vanessa and I communicate through a co-parenting app. Polite and functional, but distant. I still wonder what would have happened if Karen hadn't taken Ranger to her vet, if that microchip hadn't been scanned, if Alicia hadn't run the news story. How long would I have spiraled before something irreversible happened? How many veterans lose their service animals and never get them back? How many families weaponize these dogs without understanding the damage they're causing? Ranger's getting older now. He's 7 and still working. But German shepherds don't last forever in this role. I've started the process of getting a successor dog trained. The organization that provided Ranger has been working with a young female named Scout, who's showing promise. The transition will be hard. Ranger isn't just my medical equipment. He's my partner, my friend, the one who pulled me back from the edge repeatedly. But service animals retire eventually, and I need to be prepared. Dr. Patel says, I've made remarkable progress, that my PTSD is managed better than most veterans achieve. That Ranger's intervention early in episodes has probably prevented significant deterioration. She's written papers about our case, anonymized, but detailed, showing how service animals create measurable mental health outcomes. Sometimes I think about Karen and her husband. They were caught in someone else's crime, but still lost money and time and dealt with harassment. I sent them a letter, apologizing for the media circus. They wrote back saying they understood and were glad Ranger made it home, that they'd learned about service animals and now volunteer with a local organization, training them, that something good came from something awful. Vanessa's business never recovered from the news coverage. She ended up selling it and moving to a different city. Madison sees her less, now by Vanessa's choice. The shame of what she'd done apparently outweighed her desire to maintain the relationship. I don't feel good about that. Madison deserves a relationship with her mother, even if that relationship is complicated, but I can't force it. The advocacy work continues. I speak at veterans events about service animal protection. I've helped 3 other veterans fight similar battles with ex-partners who interfered with their dogs, won 2 cases, lost 1. The one we lost still haunts me. The dog ended up in a shelter and was adopted before we could get a court order. The veteran tried to get Seth managed without his animal and ended up hospitalized. He's still fighting to get stable, but it's been years. Some losses are permanent. Last week, Madison asked me what I'd do if someone tried to take Ranger again. I told her the truth, that I'd fight with every legal tool available, that I'd learned what protections existed and how to use them, that I'd never let anyone convince me that needing help made me weak. That Ranger wasn't a crutch. He was my medical treatment, and nobody had the right to interfere with that. She hugged Ranger and said she'd protect him too. How far would I go for the one thing keeping me alive? I went to court. I went to Congress. I changed laws. I rebuilt my life around the reality that I need help. And that's okay. Ranger isn't a sign of weakness. He's proof that I'm strong enough to accept the support I need. Strong enough to fight for my right to that support. It is not enough to survive when someone tried to take it away. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next. They also agreed to train all staff on recognizing anaphylaxis symptoms and administering emergency epinephrine, and they would stock EpiPens in multiple locations throughout the building rather than just in the nurse's office. Autumn's suspension was expuned from her record, and she received a formal letter of apology from the new interim principal, acknowledging problem to Hadalek, that her actions had saved my life and should never have resulted in disciplinary action. The state legislation inspired by my case passed both houses and was signed into law 5 months after the incident, creating new requirements for how schools across the state must handle medical emergencies during safety drills. The law specifically mandated that medical needs must be prioritized over drill compliance, and that schools must have clear protocols for students to access life-saving medications immediately, without requiring permission or following normal evacuation routes. Advocacy groups called it a landmark victory for students with disabilities and medical conditions. And my family was invited to the signing ceremony, where the governor thanked us for turning a personal tragedy into systemic change that would protect thousands of other students. Standing there in the Capitol building with cameras flashing, while the governor signed paperwork with my name attached to the bill felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life instead of living my own. A year later I can walk past the cafeteria without my heart racing quite as badly. And I've stopped having nightmares about the parking lot. Every single night. I still carry my EpiPen everywhere now despite the old rule having been changed. And I've developed anxiety around fire alarms that probably won't go away for years, based on what my therapist says about trauma responses. Autumn and I are still best friends, maybe even closer now, because of what we went through together, and she jokes sometimes about her brief career as a vigilante medication runner, even though I know the whole incident traumatized her almost as much as it did me. Mrs. Kobach transferred to a different school district after completing her required training. And I heard through the parent gossip network that she tells people she doesn't want to talk about what happened during her time at our school. The cafeteria staff still knows my face and goes out of their way to confirm that my food is safe. And I've gotten better at advocating for my needs rather than hoping adults will protect me when systems fail. The scar tissue in my throat makes swallowing uncomfortable. Sometimes, a permanent reminder of how close I came to not surviving that lunch, period. And my allergist says I'll need to be even more careful going forward, because my next reaction could be worse than the first one. My parents have become advocates for other families dealing with the school system. And my mom serves on a state committee reviewing policies around disability, accommodation, and emergency medical access in educational settings. A whole experience taught me that rules are made by people and can be changed by people. But sometimes it takes nearly dying before anyone pays attention to the ways those rules can fail the students they're supposed to protect. I graduated last spring, and I'm starting college in a few weeks at a school 3 states away, and I've already met with their disability services office to make absolutely certain they understand my medical needs and have protocols in place that prioritize my life over their rules. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next